Well, thank you for the invitation and for the warm welcome. Those of you who were here some minutes ago and listening to Timothy Parikh, you will find some similarities in what I'm going to bring to the fore. I'm going to make my presentation based on this book or report called Earth4All that was published about a year ago and that has now been translated into some 10 languages. The background is a cooperation between the Club of Rome, the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Studies, the Stockholm Resilience Center, and the Norwegian Business School. And you may ask yourself, why the Norwegian Business School? Well, one of the key participants is Jørgen Randers, and he was already in the 1970s very much engaged in these issues as one of the authors of the Limits to Growth report. We have also been supported by a large group of, I would say, thought leaders and alternative economists. So the message of the book is very well anchored, and that's also why we have right now quite a phenomenal outreach. We are supported by Kate Raworth, Otto Scharmer, Tim Jackson, Steve Keen, Bob Costanza, Emmanuel Faber, Johan Rockström, Jayati Ghosh, Per Espen Stoknes, Carlota Perez, etc., etc. So this is really a landmark report, I would say. And our starting point was really, when we started to work on this, the Limits to Growth report in 1972. I'm old enough to remember that report and the debate around it. It was published by the Club of Rome, a group of entrepreneurs, politicians, scientists, who already at that time were very much concerned about world developments. And they asked the MIT, the Massachusetts Institute for Technology, and Jay Forrester, to make a study about the future of the world, given increased populations, GDP growth increasing, production, food production, industrial production, etc. What would it mean in the long term? And the report basically said, we cannot continue growing as we do. We have to be more intelligent. It was not a doomsday report, because there were several scenarios, but business as usual, and we have followed business as usual, would mean problems for the world economy, maybe even collapse, because of a combination of resource scarcity and pollution. We didn't talk about, or the report didn't talk about this would happen in the next 5 or 10 years. It said it would happen in the next 50 to 100 years. So this means that we are now in that critical period. And unfortunately, we have to say that it was a wake-up call, but the world didn't really listen. We have pursued exactly the same kind of conventional growth policies. And of course, it has given a lot of good things, but it has a negative side. Namely, climate change, ecosystem decline, biodiversity loss, a lot of pollution. And we are also increasingly understanding that the way the economy is organized also leads to more and more inequality. And ladies and gentlemen, we still have 4 billion people on this planet. With all the wealth, still we have 4 billion people who try to survive on up to $4 a day. So a huge gap of wealth and income and standard of living. This is a graph that comes from the Planetary Boundaries report. On the left-hand side, you can see the demand for materials, growth in the economy, growth of population, all material things that have been expanding. Hockey clubs all the way. On the right-hand side, you can see the pressure on the planet, on natural systems, on the climate. And of course, you have either to be a conventional economist or an idiot if you think this can go on. It cannot go on. And we are starting to see that there are a lot of challenges around the corner. Here is energy. I was working on energy policy in the 1970s. At that time, fossil fuels made up 85% of the global energy mix. Still today, it's almost 80%. So all the investments we have done in alternatives have more or less been add-ons. We have replaced very little. And last year was a record when it comes to the production of crude oil. 100 million barrels a day. And if you add gas, you get 175 million barrels. So we are really on the wrong track. And when you look at materials, and Parik referred to that, here you see the aggregate picture of material demand in the world economy. We have tripled demand for materials since the Limits to Growth report was written or launched. The blue is biomass, primarily forestry products and food. Next comes fossil fuels, and then you have non-metal, metallic minerals and minerals. The dotted line there is economic growth, and we talked about decoupling in particular in the 1980s and 1990s. That was in the context of the Brundtland report. And we had a slight decoupling at the collapse of the Soviet Union in the 1990s. You can see that in the curve. But over the last 5 to 10 years, material demand is actually growing faster than the world economy, which means that decoupling is not really happening. And the problem is, and here I refer to the International Resource Panel, of which I'm a member, we have come to the conclusion that more than 50% of carbon emissions are directly linked to the use and the extraction and processing of materials. Steel, cement, ammoniac, aluminium, textiles, plastics, electronics. So it's not only fossil fuels that we should be concerned about. And the other thing is that also a lot of the biodiversity loss is related to material extraction. Of course, industrial agriculture, industrial forestry, and mining. And here you can see the two upper curves, that's the GDP and material use, and you can see there is no decoupling. And if we at the same time conclude that materials are the major cause of climate change or greenhouse gas emissions and biodiversity loss, we have to start to think. And what is worse, and the previous speaker also alluded to, there is a very uneven balance between wealthy countries and low-income countries. I come from Sweden. My material footprint is around 25 tons per year, aggregately. Somebody living in Zimbabwe or in Kenya or wherever in Africa has a material footprint of 2. And of course, to increase the standard of living there, they need to increase the material footprint. But if they end up at our level, the system will collapse. So we have this trick or this challenge. We have to reduce our material footprints, and they have to increase it. And how do you do that? I don't think we can explain it only in terms of growth and degrowth. We have to be more sophisticated. I agree with Timothy Parik that in the longer term, of course, we have to have a steady state economy. But how to get there is going to be very complicated. We also know that if you look at greenhouse gas emissions, 85% have been generated by wealthy countries. And here you have a map of some of the possible tipping points passing 1.5 degree. And here is the same picture that the previous speaker had, that the footprints lead to a lot of overshoot in terms of the ecology and climate in wealthy countries. So that's really the background for this report. And we build on the limits to growth, we build on the planetary boundaries report, and then comes Earth4All. And the question we ask ourselves, is it possible to offer the vast majority of the world population a decent standard of living without destroying the planet? Can it be done? And can it be done in one generation? What we conclude is that compared to 50 years ago, when we started this debate, we have a lot of technologies and a lot of solutions at hand. We know more or less what we should do. But the problem is that the economic model is not helping us to do that. It is destabilizing the planet and also destabilizing the social fabric by increasing inequalities and thereby reducing trust. So our vision is an economic system that prioritizes health and well-being of both people and the planet. And we have built a very sophisticated, I would say, I'm not a modeler, but we have built a rather sophisticated economic model that links all these issues to each other: economic, social, ecological. And we focus our attention in particular on 10 different geographical regions in terms of the economy. We look at the natural world from the perspective of the 9 planetary boundaries. And when it comes to the social responses, we try to move away from GDP growth to qualitative indicators to be able to assess how people's well-being develops. And we have a lot of novelties in the model. We look at distribution effects, owners versus workers. We looked, of course, on the impact on the planetary boundaries. We scrutinize and analyze specifically the role of the public sector in terms of welfare, in terms of infrastructure, in terms of innovation. We look at the finance system, debt levels, etc. We look at employment, population. So it's quite a thorough analysis that we bring about. And we are also playing with what we call a well-being index and a social tension index. And both these are central to the book's analysis. And of course, the goal is to enhance well-being and to lower the social tensions. Right now, we are on exactly the opposite path. So a well-being economy is the goal. We have then looked specifically at 2 scenarios. One that we call too little, too late. And it means more or less business or policy as usual. Which means that governments do, not a lot, but something about climate change. They reduce emissions. They also try to increase well-being, at least in part of the world, for the population. But it's too slow, it's too little, and it will not give the results we want. The other scenario is what we call a giant leap, where we really push in the right direction. An integrated approach, and I want to underline that. We will not arrive where we want to be if we continue to work on one issue at a time. We need integrated systemic solutions, simply because everything is linked to everything. And that's why we have such problems, because our institutions are verticalized. They deal with a small part of the agenda, when in reality they should work more horizontally. And that's why when we discuss these issues in big international gatherings and conferences, we normally bring the ministers of environment. And they are, of course, important. But the problems that are being discussed, they concern the Ministry of Industry, the Ministry of Transport, the Ministry of Agriculture, etc., etc. So we have to rethink institutions if this is going to be possible. But anyway, these are the 2 scenarios. And if you want to look at them graphically, you have this oil tanker that is very, very slow to move, and then you have the giant leap, which is what we hope can be implemented. Now, anyway, after a thorough analysis, we came to one basic conclusion. We need 5 transformative changes. And we start with poverty. We have to address poverty much, much more aggressively than we have done in the past. Secondly, we have to address inequalities. And you can see here that I come from a background where we were mostly concerned about nature and the economy and nature. But now, when we try to address these issues, we come to the conclusion that unless we start with the social ills, we are not going to solve this. Because how can you bring people with you in such an unequal world, if you talk about the long-term issues? So these are the 2 important transformations. The third one is empowerment of women, because we believe strongly that we have to put women at the center of development, and we have to give them the right place in society. The fourth transformation is food systems. So important, because food systems, the way they are organized today, are not sustainable in the long term. We have managed to get high yields by a lot of fertilizers, pesticides, by soil erosion, etc., etc. The industrial production system has given us a lot of good things for 30, 40 years, but it's not sustainable. So we need to rethink food systems. We need also, of course, to do something about diets and food waste. 35% of all the food produced in this world is being wasted. In this part of the world, because of ignorance, because of that we can afford it. In the poor parts of the world, because of poor storage facilities, poor transportation, logistics, etc., etc. And then the fifth transformation is the energy transformation. So if we do these 5 in a proper way, we believe we can achieve the giant leap. I would have liked a 6th transformation, which deals with material consumption. Now we have that as a cross-cutting issue, and it's coming into at least the energy and the food system transformations. But I believe our next report will be on material consumption as the main driver of almost everything that is not good on this planet. Now, if we look at then specifically the poverty turnaround, what do we aim at? First of all, low-income countries must have debt relief. Most of them are very heavily indebted, and they became more indebted during the pandemic. The way the wealthy countries acted during the pandemic is, in my opinion, a disaster. So debt relief is number 1. Secondly, we have to look at trade institutions, financial institutions, and intellectual property rights institutions. All of them are organized or designed in a way that they benefit primarily the rich countries. And we shouldn't underestimate the influence of the US and to some extent the European Union in these institutions. And we need to make sure that low-income countries do not only export raw materials, but can export value added, because that's where the economy can develop nicely. But there is a bias against that in the trade system. We also need to make sure that the financial system offers opportunities for low-income countries through the so-called special drawing rights, which is a mechanism that was put in place many decades ago, but it has mainly serviced wealthy economies. But here is a great need of investment in green infrastructure in many low-income countries. And it's simply not happening because of a shortage of capital. By the way, I read an article the other day. Out of all the money that has been invested in solar and wind between 2000 and 2020, less than 2% has been invested in low-income countries. Less than 2%. And that's where the majority of the people are living, and many of them are also not provided with electricity. So it's really one example where you need dramatic change. So that's about the poverty turnaround. Inequality turnaround, well, let's face it, we have to tax rich people more. In my country, for instance, we have no property tax, we have no inheritance tax, we have no gift tax, and the tax on property, like buildings, etc., is very, very low. We tax labor and income a lot, but not the financial side. So that's number one. Second is, of course, to strengthen unions in different parts of the world. The opposite has been happening over the last decades. And thirdly, we introduce something that is quite novel, what we call a universal basic dividend, which is really to put a fee on the use of the commons. Commons in the form of mines, in the form of oil and gas, etc., in the form of agriculture, in the form of fresh water, but also in the form of the high-tech industry, the internet, and the financial infrastructure. The idea is that those who benefit from those commons, and they are many, should not be able to do it for free, because it belongs to our joint inheritance. It belongs to us all. Why should Saudi Arabia earn all this incredible money just because they happen to be close to some oil and gas fields? Why should a company who sits on a copper mine be the only one benefiting from the riches from that copper mine? So we believe a fee on every use of a common should be put into a fund and then distributed equally among the world population. It's not really a tax, it's a fee. And then you ask yourself, is this possible? Isn't this communism? Well, it so happens that a Republican governor in the state of Alaska in the US introduced this system a few years ago. So on every extraction in terms of mines and oil and gas in Alaska, a fee is paid. And last year, each individual, including small babies, received $3,000 in their bank account. And you can just imagine, if this was a system globally, what it would mean, in particular, for poor people. Empowerment turnaround, primarily focusing on education for girls. Increase of access to reproductive health, family planning, boosting female leadership in different positions, etc., etc. Food turnaround, I already talked about the diets, to move more to plant-based diets, doing away in particular with industrial production of meat, minimize food waste, and then what I think is the most interesting element in the whole book, moving from today's agriculture to what we call regenerative or conservation agriculture, where you always keep the ground green. The ground is always green, so you maximize photosynthesis and how you capture the solar energy. You try to build carbon in the soil by no-tilling. So low tilling or no tilling. And you vary the crops in a way that you need less of inputs in terms of fertilizers and pesticides. It's a fascinating alternative agricultural system that ironically started in the US, in the Midwest, and that's now taking on more and more in other parts of the world. And for the first time, I believe agriculture could move from being a benefit, a real benefit to society, and not have all these negative side effects that we have been used to. And I think this is important because agriculture is a big source of water demand, it's a big source of global greenhouse gas emissions, it's a big source of nitrogen excess flows into rivers and lakes, etc., etc. And the fifth is the energy turnaround, focusing on electrifying as much as possible, overinvest in renewable energy, solar and wind. Thereby you reduce the need for storage and batteries, and of course focusing a lot on energy system efficiency. Now this is in a nutshell what the book or the report is all about. Of course, all these turnarounds have to be supported by flanking measures. We would need a much better global governance in the world to make this happen. One country cannot do it alone. We could start doing it in the European Union, of course. But in today's world, with the tension building between the US and China and with Putin's aggression in Ukraine, it's difficult to see in the short term. But we can't give up. We have to work for a better situation. Secondly, we have to rethink conventional economics. From short-termism to long-termism, we have to rein in the financial sector, who is speculative to a large extent. We have to be much more proactive in terms of innovation. We have to initiate a discussion on quality of life. Timothy was alluding to that as well. To measure progress in terms of GDP growth is silly. It doesn't tell you anything about the quality in society. It can be positive, but it can be also very negative. Herman Daly, who is one of my heroes, he wrote a book where he started by distinguishing between economic growth and uneconomic growth. And this is so important. And then we need well-being indicators to replace GDP. But we need to engage citizens into a discussion about what the hell is quality of life. It's not only to buy stuff in the market. It's about so many other things, about health, about a happy life, happy family, good education, clean environment, stable climate. But if you only focus on material consumption, you don't really notice that. So this is, I think, very, very important. Then, of course, going back to materials from linear to circular production. Circularity is not a panacea, but it's a step in the right direction. And then finally, we have to start taxing the bad things, not the good things. And here again, a tax reform would be to lower the taxes on income and increase the taxes on the use of nature. By the way, that's the only way to make circularity work, because in most areas, virgin materials are cheaper than secondary materials. And as long as this is the case, companies will not shift. So, Mr. Chairman, this is in a nutshell my message. I have a few slides here which shows that the giant leap, if we can make it happen, would drastically reduce global poverty. It would reduce social tensions because trust in society would be higher. It would increase well-being for everybody. And emissions would be greatly reduced compared to too little too late, which is the path we are just now following. So again, I'm happy to have shared this with you. I should add that a couple of weeks ago, we presented to the Secretary General at the UN a condensed version of the report where we looked at how giant leap would, that scenario in our book, how it would help implement the Sustainable Development Goals. And of course, we will not reach these goals till 2030, because that's impossible given where we are. But the chance is good that we would do it later on during this century. Thank you very much.